The crystal was Venetian and very old, and when Lady Lacy raised her glass, the candlelight caught in the stem and threw a pale arc across the tablecloth like a blade. There were 14 at table that evening: the Cheshams, Sir Godfrey Price and his wife, the Reverend and Mrs. Holloway, two officers from the garrison whose names Emmeline had already forgotten, and the family. The family meant her mother at the head, her father Sir Philip at the foot, her sister Rosalind in the place of honor to their mother's right, and Emmeline beside her husband, Hugo Drayton, the sixth Duke of Drayton, who had been cutting his pheasant with the quiet attention of a man listening to everything and responding to none of it. "To Rosalind," Lady Lacy said, and her voice carried the particular brightness she reserved for rooms she wished to command, "who has made us so very proud this season. Her watercolors exhibited at the Royal Academy, her performance at Lady Chesham's musical evening, her grace in everything she undertakes. We are blessed beyond measure in our eldest daughter." She did not look at Emmeline. She did not need to. The omission was the point, and everyone at the table understood it, as they had understood it at every dinner, every gathering, every public occasion in this house for as long as Emmeline could remember. Lady Lacy did not dislike her younger daughter. She simply did not see her, and in the currency of the ton, invisibility was its own verdict. The guests raised their glasses. Lord Chesham murmured something generous. Mrs. Holloway smiled. Rosalind, who was not unkind, colored slightly and glanced across the table at Emmeline with an expression that held the familiar shape of apology, the kind worn so often it had lost its edges. Emmeline lifted her glass. She had been lifting it at these moments since she was 15 years old, the second daughter who played no instrument with distinction, whose watercolors were competent rather than remarkable, whose manner was too still for her mother's taste, and whose silence was read always as absence. She had learned long ago that composure was not the same as indifference, though the people around this table had never troubled to discover the difference. Hugo set down his glass. He did it without sound, placed it on the cloth beside his plate with the controlled precision of a man settling something rather than abandoning it. Then he rose. His chair moved back against the carpet, and the sound was small and definitive, like a door being closed. He stood at his full height beside the table, his dark evening tailcoat sharp against the candlelight, his white waistcoat buttoned precisely, his cravat tied in the mathematical knot his valet preferred, and he did not sit again. For a moment, the table did not know what to make of it. A duke standing mid-course was unusual. A duke standing mid-toast was an act with social weight that even Lord Chesham, who was not given to nuance, could feel pressing against the evening like a change in weather. "Forgive me," Hugo said. His voice was pleasant, unhurried, pitched to carry exactly as far as the walls of the dining room, and no further. "I find I should like to add to Lady Lacy's toast if the table will permit it." Lady Lacy's smile held, though something shifted behind it, the faintest recalibration of a woman who had spent 30 years managing rooms and had just felt one move without her hand on it. "Of course, Your Grace," she said. Hugo lifted his glass from the table without sitting to retrieve it. He held it at the level of his chest, not raised, not offered, simply held, and he looked at Emmeline. "To the Duchess of Drayton," he said, "who has, in the 14 months since our marriage, reorganized the household accounts at Drayton Park and saved the estate £1,100, who identified the drainage failure on the South Tennant farms that 3 stewards before Bourne had overlooked, because she troubled herself to walk the land and listen to the tenants rather than read the reports written about them, who sat with Mrs. Yarrow for 4 evenings while the housekeeper recovered from a fever, not because it was required of her, but because she understood that the woman had no family to do it." The table had gone still. Lord Chesham's fork was suspended. Mrs. Price had turned in her chair. Rosalind was staring at Hugo with an expression Emmeline could not read, and did not try to, because she was looking at her husband and discovering that he had been paying attention all along, in every room, on every occasion, through every silence she had believed was mutual. "Who has never once," Hugo continued, and his voice did not rise, but something in it deepened, settled into the register he used in the House of Lords when he wished to point to land without repetition, "required anyone at this table or any other to see her in order to know her own worth. That's not a deficit of accomplishment. It is a surplus of character, and I will stand for it." He drank. He did not sit. Sir Philip Lacy, at the foot of the table, looked at his wife with an expression that contained something Emmeline had not seen from her father in years. A quiet, exhausted recognition, as though a truth he had carried privately for a very long time had just been spoken aloud by someone with the authority to make it heard. Lady Lacy set down her glass. Her color was high, but she was a woman of considerable social intelligence, and she understood immediately that the room had shifted. What Hugo had done was not a correction in the way a rebuke would have been. It was a recalibration. He had not diminished Rosalind. He had not attacked Lady Lacy. He had simply filled the space that had been left empty, and by filling it, he had made the emptiness visible to everyone who had been sitting comfortably inside it. The footman came forward with the next course. Hugo remained standing. "Your Grace," Lady Lacy said with the careful lightness of a woman testing ice, "you must be tired. Do sit." "I am very well, Lady Lacy. Thank you." He stayed on his feet. The meal continued around him and beneath him, and his standing became the fixed point of the evening, the thing no one mentioned and no one could look away from. When Lord Chesham attempted a toast to Sir Philip's new mare, Hugo waited for it to finish and then, still standing, said, "Her Grace rode that mare last Thursday. She has a better seat than I do. Sir Philip knows it." Sir Philip, startled into honesty, said, "She does, always has done." When Mrs. Price complimented the table arrangement, the roses, the silver, the placement of the candelabra, Hugo said mildly, "My wife arranged our table at Drayton Park last month for 18 guests. The Countess of Harewood wrote to say it was the most elegant evening she had attended in 3 seasons. She did not write to me." Each correction was quiet. Each was specific. Each was delivered with the unhurried precision of a man who was not angry, who was, Emmeline realized, doing something far more unsettling than anger. He was assembling a portrait of her in front of people who had never troubled to look, and he was doing it with the same methodical patience she brought to everything, and she understood, with a clarity that pressed against her chest like a hand, that he had learned it from her. When Mrs. Holloway, attempting to rescue the conversation, asked Lady Lacy about the plans for Rosalind's upcoming season, Hugo said, without interrupting, without raising his voice, "The Duchess has been corresponding with 3 families in the parish about the school fund. She has raised £40 this quarter through her own letters. I mention it because I believe Mrs. Holloway's parish might benefit from the same approach, and my wife would be glad to share it." Mrs. Holloway turned to Emmeline with genuine interest, and Emmeline answered her, calmly, specifically, as though the evening were not unraveling and rebuilding itself around her. And for a moment the conversation at the table was between 2 women discussing practical charity, and Hugo stood above it and let it happen. And the room understood that this was precisely his point, that Emmeline Drayton had substance, that the substance had been there all along, occupying space that no one had troubled to examine. Lady Lacy's hands were still on the tablecloth. She had not lifted her glass since Hugo's toast. The burgundy silk of her evening gown caught the candlelight in heavy folds, and she sat very straight, the way she always sat when she was aware of being observed. And for the first time in Emmeline's memory, her mother's straightness looked like effort rather than authority. Sir Godfrey Price, who was a blunt man and not given to social choreography, said to Hugo, "Your Grace, you make a compelling case for your wife. I confess I had not heard the half of it." "No," Hugo said pleasantly, "you had not. That is rather the difficulty." Rosalind, midway through the fish course, leaned across the table toward Emmeline. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I have always been sorry." "I know," Emmeline said, and meant it. Rosalind's crime was not malice. It was acceptance. She had accepted the role their mother had written for her, and in doing so had accepted the role written for Emmeline as well, and neither of them had examined it until a man who had been cutting his pheasant in silence decided to stand up. The evening pressed on. 2 more courses came and went. Hugo stood through all of them. He stood while the syllabub was served, and while Lord Chesham told an interminable anecdote about a dog. He stood while the candles burned lower, and the room grew warmer, and the conversation thinned to the polite murmur of people who wanted very badly to go home and discuss what they had witnessed. He was not rigid or militant in his standing. He leaned one hand lightly against the back of his chair. He shifted his weight occasionally. He participated in conversation with the ease of a man who happened to be upright. But he did not sit, and after 2 hours the fact of it had become enormous, a silence made of posture, an argument made entirely of verticality. Emmeline watched him across the length of the evening and felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in 14 months of careful, competent, uncomplaining marriage. She felt seen. Not admired, not pitied, seen. Known in the specific unromantic detail of who she actually was by a man she had assumed did not care to look. She had come to the marriage without illusion. Hugo Drayton needed a wife, or his mother was dead, his estates required a mistress, and Emmeline Lacey was available, presentable, and unlikely to cause difficulty. Her father had been pleased. Her mother had been satisfied in the way she was satisfied by anything that confirmed her theory of her daughters. Rosalind for glory, Emmeline for utility. The courtship, such as it was, had lasted 3 weeks. Hugo had called on Sir Philip twice, spoken to Emmeline 4 times, once at dinner, once in the garden while Lady Lacy steered Rosalind past him at every opportunity, and twice in the drawing-room where Emmeline had been reading, and he had been waiting for Sir Philip, and neither of them had attempted to fill the silence with conversation. It was the silence that had decided him, Emmeline believed, not her beauty. Rosalind was the beauty, not her accomplishments. Rosalind was the accomplished one. The silence. He had sat in a room with a woman who did not perform, and he had found it bearable, and for Hugo Drayton, bearable was the highest compliment he knew how to pay. The wedding had been at the parish church in April, with white campion along the altar rail and a cold wind that came through the door every time a latecomer entered. Lady Lacy had cried, not for Emmeline, but for the rank. A duke. Even the lesser daughter could be useful if she brought a duke into the family. Emmeline had stood at the altar in ivory muslin with seed pearl edging at the bodice and sleeves, and Hugo had spoken his vows with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything, and she had spoken hers with the composure she had been building since childhood, and they had walked out into the April wind as husband and wife, and neither of them had pretended it was a love match, because they were both too honest for theater and too proud for self-deception. Hugo had been courteous. Courteous at the wedding breakfast, courteous in the carriage afterward, courteous in the vast silences of Drayton Park where the hallways were wide enough to pass without touching. He had never been unkind. He had simply been elsewhere, present at meals, engaged in estate business, attentive to his seat in the House of Lords where he spoke infrequently but precisely, and absent in the particular way of a man who had married for necessity and considered the necessity met. Emmeline had not minded. She told herself she had not minded. She had the household, the tenants, Mrs. Yarrow's quiet companionship, Bourne's steady efficiency with the land, the library that Hugo never entered, and she never left. She had purpose without performance, usefulness without applause, and if it was a smaller life than Rosalind's, it was at least her own. But Hugo had been watching. She understood that now, standing, sitting, across from him at her mother's table, while the Venetian crystal caught the candlelight, and the room held its breath around a man who would not sit down. He had been watching when she walked the tenant farms. He had been watching when she sat with Mrs. Yarrow. He had been watching when she reorganized the accounts and found the drainage failure and arranged the table for the Countess of Harewood's dinner, and did all of it without telling him, because she had assumed, as her mother had taught her to assume, that no one was interested. The guests began to leave. Lord and Lady Chesham first, with significant glances and the barely contained energy of people carrying gossip they intended to distribute across Mayfair by morning. Then the Prices. Then the officers who were young enough to look thrilled. The Holloways lingered, as clergy do, but eventually the Reverend took his wife's arm, and they went, and the hall was empty except for the family and the footmen clearing the silver and the sound of carriages on the gravel outside. Lady Lacy stood in the doorway of the dining room. She had held her composure through the evening. She was, whatever else, a woman who understood the social cost of a public fracture, but now, with the audience gone, something in her bearing tightened. She was not accustomed to being managed in her own house, and Hugo Drayton's standing had managed her more completely than any speech could have done. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice was controlled but thin, like fine china under pressure. "I hope you found the evening to your satisfaction." Hugo had moved to the doorway. He was still standing. He had not sat since the toast. Emmeline was beside him, her pale cream silk evening gown catching the last of the candlelight from the hall sconces, her face composed, her hands still. "Lady Lacy," Hugo said, You have 2 daughters. I married one of them. I did not marry the lesser one." Lady Lacy opened her mouth and closed it. The sentence was not an attack. It did not lend itself to defense because it contained no accusation, only a fact stated with the flat finality of a man who had made his position clear and did not intend to argue it. "I was not suggesting," she began. "You raised a toast to the accomplishments of one daughter in the presence of both," Hugo said, "in the presence of her husband, in the presence of your guests. You may not have intended it as a judgment, Lady Lacy, but I assure you, every person at that table received it as one. I am a duke. I understand how public speech operates. So do you." He paused, and in the pause the hallway was very quiet. The candles in the wall sconces flickered against the draft from the front door, and somewhere in the servants' passage beyond the dining room, a plate clinked as the footman cleared the final course, and the sound was domestic and small, and made the hallway feel enormous. "I have sat at this table 3 times since our marriage," Hugo continued. "At each dinner, I've watched you speak of Rosalind's season, Rosalind's invitations, Rosalind's prospects, as though your second daughter were a chair, present, functional, beneath remark. I said nothing on those occasions because I believed it was not my concern. I was wrong. She is my wife. Her dignity is my concern. And her dignity has been treated carelessly in this house for longer than I have known her." Sir Philip had come into the hall behind his wife. He stood with his hands at his sides and he did not speak, but he was looking at Hugo with an expression Emmeline recognized, the gratitude of a man who had been saying something for years into a room that had refused to hear it. "Emmeline has never asked me to defend her," Hugo said. "I suspect she has never asked anyone to defend her because she was taught, here in this house, that she was not the daughter worth defending. I am telling you now that she is. And I'm telling you that the next time I sit at your table, I expect to hear her name in your toast, not because I demanded it, but because you have learned to see what I see." He offered Emmeline his arm. She took it. Her fingers rested on his sleeve, and she could feel the tension in the muscle beneath the wool, the effort it had cost him to stand for 2 hours without anger, to correct without cruelty, to hold a room by the simple act of refusing to sit in it. He was not a demonstrative man. He was a man who had, tonight, chosen a single action and committed to it completely, and she loved him for the discipline of it as much as the sentiment. In the carriage, the lanterns threw moving shadows across the velvet seats. Emmeline sat with her hands in her lap, and Hugo sat across from her, sat at last, and for a long time neither of them spoke. The horses moved through the dark and the wheels turned on the road, and the silence between them was different from every silence that had come before it. It was not the silence of 2 people who had nothing to say. It was the silence of 2 people deciding what to say first. "You did not need to do that," Emmeline said at last. Her voice was steady, but there was a catch in it that she did not try to disguise because she had spent 14 months disguising everything and she was tired of it. "I did," Hugo said. "I needed to do it 14 months ago. I needed to do it the first time I sat at that table and watched her speak about Rosalind's watercolors as though you were not in the room. I did not do it then because I was—" He stopped. He looked at her in the carriage lamplight, and she saw something in his face she had never seen before. Not guilt exactly, but the close cousin of it, the expression of a man confronting his own negligence. "I was not paying attention. I thought I was, but I was not. I heard the accounts. I saw the drainage reports. I knew Mrs. Yarrow had been ill and that you had been the one to sit with her. I knew all of it, Emmeline, and I put none of it together because I had decided, when we married, that ours would be a courteous arrangement and nothing more, and I held to that decision long past the point where it was honest." Emmeline looked at him. She could feel the tears behind her eyes, but she held them there, not out of composure, not this time, but because she wanted to see him clearly while he spoke. "When did you know?" she asked. "Know what?" "That it was not courteous, that it was more." Hugo was quiet for a moment. The carriage rocked gently over a rut in the road, and the shadows shifted. "The Harewood dinner," he said. "When the Countess wrote, I read her letter, and I realized I could not remember the evening, because I had spent it watching you move through the room, and I had told myself I was merely being observant, and that was a lie. I was watching you because I could not help it. Because you are, when you move through a room, Emmeline, you change it, not loudly, not the way your mother wants a room changed. You change it the way a lamp changes a room. The room does not know it was dark until you are in it." Emmeline closed her eyes. She pressed her hands together in her lap and let the sentence settle into her. And when she opened her eyes, she said, I found a letter, 3 months ago, on your desk, from Lady Greville, inviting you to her house party in September. You had written your reply. You had written, the Duchess and I will attend, and then crossed out the Duchess and written only I. You changed it back. I saw both versions. Hugo stared at her. You saw that. I see everything, Emmeline said quietly. I have always seen everything. It is what happens when no one is looking at you. You learn to look at everyone else. Hugo leaned forward. He took her hand from her lap and held it between both of his, and his grip was firm and certain and warm, and she could feel his pulse through the kid leather of her gloves. I am looking at you now, he said. I should like to go on looking, if you will let me. You stood for 2 hours, Emmeline said, through the syllabub. The syllabub was indifferent. You stood through Lord Chesham's anecdote about the dog. That, Hugo said, required more discipline than anything else this evening. Emmeline felt the laugh before she heard it, a small, involuntary sound that broke from her chest like something uncorked, and Hugo's face changed when he heard it. His expression opened in a way she had never seen, as though he had been waiting for that sound, without knowing he was waiting, and the discovery of it had rearranged something fundamental in the architecture of his composure. I should like to hear that more often, he said quietly. I should like to earn it. Emmeline turned her hand inside his and laced her fingers through. It was a small gesture, the kind her mother would have dismissed as insufficient, the kind Rosalind would have found inadequate for a scene of such weight, but it was theirs, and it was precise, and it was enough. They did not speak again for the rest of the drive. They did not need to. The silence between them had changed its nature entirely, from the emptiness of disregard to the fullness of two people sitting in the knowledge of each other, and when the carriage lamps of Drayton Park appeared through the trees, Emmeline watched them grow closer and understood that she was coming home for the first time. Mrs. Yarrow was waiting in the hall when they arrived. She had hot water sent up and the fire built in the Duchess's bedchamber, and she took one look at Emmeline's face and said nothing, because Mrs. Yarrow was a woman who understood the weight of an evening by the way a person carried themselves through the doorway, and what she saw in Emmeline's bearing that night was not exhaustion or distress, but the particular quiet of a woman who had set something down. Bourne had left the morning's correspondence on Hugo's desk, as was his habit, and when Hugo passed the study he paused, then entered and sat at last in a chair, the first time he had sat since the toast, and took a sheet of paper from the drawer and wrote 4 lines. He folded the letter and left it on Emmeline's writing desk in the morning room, propped against the small vase of garden roses she refreshed every 3rd day, a habit he had noticed, as he had noticed everything, too late and then all at once. The letter read, You have made this house into something I did not know it could be. I should have said so the first morning I saw it. Forgive me for the months I spent sitting down. H. Emmeline found it the next day. She read it once, folded it, and placed it in the drawer of her writing desk, beside the household accounts and the correspondence from the Countess of Harewood. She did not keep it in a locket or press it between the pages of a book of verse. She kept it where she kept the things that mattered, among the evidence of her work, her competence, her life. That was what made it valuable. The months that followed were not a transformation. Hugo did not become a different man. He was still reserved, still precise, still more comfortable with ledgers than with declarations. But he began to sit beside her in the library. He began to walk the tenant farms with her on Thursdays, and when he disagreed with her assessment of the south pasture drainage, she wanted to reroute. He thought it could be repaired. They argued about it for 3 days with the kind of focused, specific pleasure that only 2 methodical people can take in disagreement, and Bourne watched from a distance and said nothing, because he was a steward, and stewards knew when to be absent. Rosalind came to Drayton Park in September. She was quieter than before, not diminished, but recalibrated, carrying the dinner party like a weight she had not known she was bearing until it was named. She and Emmeline walked in the garden on the 2nd afternoon, and Rosalind said, I should have stood up years ago. You did not know you were sitting, Emmeline said. Now that is worse. No, it is simply what happened. We were both taught the same thing, that my role was to be small and yours was to be bright. You believed it because it served you. I believed it because I had no evidence otherwise. Now, we both know better. Rosalind took her sister's arm, and they walked the length of the garden in silence. and when they returned to the house, Rosalind sat beside Emmeline at tea and spoke to Hugo about the drainage with the genuine interest of a woman trying, for the first time, to see her sister's life as worthy of attention. Lady Lacy came to Drayton Park in November. She came alone, without Sir Philip, and she brought a small watercolor she had painted herself. The garden at the family house, seen from Emmeline's old bedroom window, the view that Emmeline had looked at every morning of her girlhood, and that Lady Lacy had never, until now, realized her daughter could see. It was an awkward visit. Lady Lacy moved through the house with the careful attention of a woman seeing it for the first time, though she had been twice before. She admired the morning room, which Emmeline had arranged with the writing desk beneath the window and the garden roses in the small blue vase on the sill. She asked about the tenants and listened to the answers with an effort that was visible and therefore, Emmeline thought, genuine. Effort was more honest than ease. Ease could be performed. Effort could not. On the second evening, Lady Lacy sat in the drawing-room with Emmeline while Hugo read in the library, and she said, without preamble, "I did not know about the school fund, or the drainage, or Mrs. Yarrow's illness." "No," Emmeline said. "I should have known." "Yes." Lady Lacy looked at her hands. They were still elegant hands. She had always been a handsome woman, and age had not diminished her so much as clarified her, and she turned them over in her lap as though examining them for evidence of something she had failed to hold. "Your father tried to tell me," she said, "more than once. I thought he was being sentimental." "He was being accurate," Emmeline said. "They are not the same thing, but they are not mutually exclusive." She did not apologize. Lady Lacy was not a woman built for apology, and Emmeline did not require one. What she required was evidence, and Lady Lacy provided it in the only language she understood. She sat at Emmeline's table, and she raised a toast. "To Emmeline," she said, and her voice was not bright. It was careful, effortful, the voice of a woman doing something unfamiliar with the determination of a woman who had been told by a duke who would not sit down that it was necessary. "Who has always been more than I knew how to see." Hugo lifted his glass. Emmeline lifted hers. The crystal caught the candlelight, and this time the arc it threw across the cloth was warm and small and sufficient. 3 years later, Drayton Park had a son, Philip, after Sir Philip, who wept at the christening and could not explain why, though everyone present understood. The boy had Emmeline's eyes and Hugo's stillness, and when he was old enough to sit in a chair at the dining table, he sat with the composed attention of a child who had been taught, by example rather than instruction, that the people around him deserved to be seen. Emmeline oversaw the nursery through Mrs. Yarrow, who had become less a housekeeper and more a fixed institution, and Hugo oversaw Philip's early education with the grave attention of a man who intended his son to notice people, all people, early and completely. In the library, where Emmeline still spent her mornings, the watercolor from Lady Lacy hung beside the window. It was not a remarkable painting. The perspective was slightly wrong, and the garden was flattered by softer colors than it deserved. But it was evidence of a woman who had walked to a window she had passed 1,000 times, looked through it, and for the first time drawn what her daughter had seen. Hugo sat in the library most evenings now. He read while Emmeline worked, and occasionally he looked up and watched her, and she let him, because being seen was no longer a surprise. It was the settled condition of her life, as natural and unremarkable as the roses in the morning-room vase, that she still refreshed every third day, and that he still noticed, every time, and sometimes mentioned, and sometimes did not, because the noticing was the point, not the saying. And in the dining room at Drayton Park, the table was set for family suppers with the same care Emmeline had always brought to everything. The silver straight, the candles lit, the crystal clean, and catching the light. When guests came, Hugo sat. He always sat now. But Emmeline knew, and Hugo knew, and Mrs. Yarrow knew, in the way that housekeepers know everything, that he had earned the right to sit by, first understanding what it meant to stand. They arrive here, like a name spoken at last in the right room whenever they are ready.